I like the idea. I've been enjoying this class already as it is, but I think it's especially appropriate as we start off the new year to be talking about hope and to be talking about hope in the face of cynicism, because I think it would be easy to look around and think about where we're headed in 2022 and what's going to happen in this next year and be kind of cynical about it, right? To be disappointed in a lot of things. And so, hope in the face of cynicism. Let's do a quick review of a little bit of where we have been already. Hope's foundation, we said, was that funny little word that we don't use every day, but I hope by the time we're done with this class, it's going to be a word that you know immediately, and you know immediately what it means, and it is what? What is the foundation of our hope? Propitiation. All right, good. I got more than one person saying it now. Good. All right. By the end of this class, we're going to all know propitiation. And what is propitiation? Oh, man, we're so close. Yes. Okay, so it's the sacrifice that turns God's wrath into God's favor. All right? Propitiation is the sacrifice that turns God's wrath into God's favor. And of course, that is the sacrifice of his son Jesus. All right? Now, the foundation of our hope is that sacrifice. That is what everything else that we're going to talk about in this class is built upon, is that foundation of Jesus' sacrifice, right? Because without that sacrifice, we don't have anything to hope for at all, right? All right, so then we talked about hope's fountain welling up within us. It is not something that is just a small, like, water fountain. You go over there and you push the button and this little stream comes out. This is a geyser. This is an overflowing fountain within us. And we said that it overflows. It's hard to contain because our fountain of hope is our what? Inheritance. Yes. And we looked at Peter's description of that inheritance as something that is something that will never spoil or fade, something that doesn't have an expiration date, and all those kinds of things that are a little unfamiliar to us in this world, because everything breaks, everything falls apart, everything has an expiration date, but not our inheritance through Jesus. And then last week we talked about the flourishing of hope. And we said that the way that hope can flourish is when we focus on helping others. Rather than just focusing on ourselves, hope really flourishes when we use that hope to do good in this world, to share the good news of Jesus, to help others in need, etc., etc., etc. All right? So we've talked about hope's foundation. We've talked about hope's fountain within us. We've talked about hope's flourishing as we focus outward rather than inward. Now, I think if there's one thing, got to turn it on before it'll work. If there's one thing that we can all agree on about the world in which we live today, it's that this world has changed a lot in our lifetime. Will you agree with that? Yes? No? Yes? This world has changed a lot in our lifetime. Now, I know most of y'all look at me and think, his lifetime, that's not very long. He's just a kid. Okay, let me tell you about who's just a kid. When I try and talk to Jackson about things that just seem like it's not that long ago, and he says, yeah, that was before I was born. And I'm like, oh, good grief. Okay, so seriously though, so much has changed in our lifetimes, and even just in the last 20 years, just in the last 25 years. Think about how much in this world has changed. Now, give us some examples. What are some things that have significantly changed about the world in which we live? Okay, both of those answers are tied together: cell phones and technology. Okay, how have cell phones changed the world? Okay, they have, excuse me, they have changed the way we communicate. Okay, uh, it's funny that you bring that up because that's one of the things that I talk to Jackson about that he doesn't understand. I talk about paying for your phone based on how long you have talked on the phone, and that blows his mind because we used to pay by the minute, right? You paid a certain amount, whether it was cell phones or your landline. Even you paid by the minute. I had a limit on how many long distance phone calls I could make when I was younger, because I only had so much money, and my parents made me pay for my long distance phone calls. And then when we first got cell phones, boy, I was counting down until that 7 o'clock or whatever at night when you could actually call for free, or you'd wait to call somebody until the weekends because you knew it was going to be a long conversation and you didn't want to pay so much for it, right? And I was saying just something off the cuff about that one time to Jackson, and he just had a blank stare at me like I was speaking German. And I was like, "You've never paid for minutes on a phone, have you?" And he said, "No, why would I?" So it has changed the way we communicate simply by making communication 1,000% easier, right? Because you can call somebody anytime, anywhere. You can send them a quick text if it's something that doesn't require a conversation. You can communicate with people quickly, easily, and you can communicate with multiple people at once through your favorite group texts, which blow up your phone when people respond to the group. Yay. Okay, so communication has changed drastically just in the last 20 years. What else has changed significantly in the world around us? Okay, information is available and is there so much quicker and easier. I remember that there was a statistic at one point that said if you took all the information that was readily available to folks in 1900, it doubled by 1950. All the information that was available to humanity in 1900, that doubled by 1950. And then that doubled again by like 1970. And then that doubled again by like 1995. And who knows how much that has progressed or how quickly that has progressed. Just the sheer volume of information available to us. Now, that can be good or bad, right? Because in some ways it's good to be able to find information that you need, but it also means sometimes you find information that you don't need. WebMD. How many times have people been misdiagnosed or misdiagnosed themselves? Jeremy probably has a lot to say about things like that. Bad information is readily available too, right? Yeah, how many kids? I'm thinking, I'm wondering if Jackson has ever even opened an encyclopedia. Because you think about why do that when you can get online and do research online and find all kinds of information there. Now, when I was going through college, I remember This is kind of when Wikipedia was just kind of getting started, and those kinds of things were available to us online. And every professor said, Wikipedia is not a source. And so we were afraid to do research online, and we were convinced that that was a terrible idea. Don't ever do your research online. You have to use books and magazine articles and resources like that. And so but nowadays, that's not the way things are. All right, so information has changed drastically in our time. Technology, cell phones have changed so much about the way that we do things, the way that we communicate, the way that we live our lives. Think about things like just health care in general, and the abilities that are available today, the procedures that today are outpatient that just 10, 15, 20 years ago, you would have spent a few days in the hospital just by having that procedure. And now it's nothing. No big deal. Go get it done. Surgeries that it just blows my mind how quickly things are progressing in areas like that. Okay, so the world in which we live has changed drastically, and because of that, sometimes what that means is we struggle with how to deal with those changes. And that could be everything from technology to how to deal with technology, or sometimes a refusal to deal with technology, right? But sometimes the changes are changes that are completely counter to our moral standards. Think about how much that has changed in the society, in the world in which we live, compared to even just 20 years ago. And when we're faced with those kinds of challenges, I think sometimes the temptation for us is to do this. To try and go unnoticed. To try and hunker down, huddle up with our familiar people who think like we do, keep our heads down, and just try to press on through it. Now, 2 weeks ago, we talked about persecution as Christians. We talked about how hope's fountain welling up within us, that hope of our inheritance, is going to help us endure the challenges of this life, the persecution that may come because of our faith, and how we need to persevere through those things. And that is still very, very true. We want to use hope to sustain us. This is not the same thing. That doesn't mean that enduring is the same as just trying to get through life unnoticed. Because if you think about it, this way of dealing with the changes in the world around us is just an example of what you could call passive cynicism. Think about that for a second. By doing nothing, by giving up and just trying to get through to the end, we have essentially judged the world as unsavable and without hope. And that is a very dangerous position for Christians to be in. So, rather than this approach to the changes in the world around us, rather than trying to hide from those changes, or trying to ignore those changes, or trying to just keep our head down and press forward, we should turn to the focus of our hope. And to help us understand how to focus our hope, I want us to open our Bibles to 2 Timothy chapter 1. Second Timothy chapter 1. And we're going to read verses 8 through 12. Somebody with a good loud voice, go ahead and start reading 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 8 through 12. Okay, stop right there. Okay, I want us to get a sense of Paul's tone. First of all, where is Paul? He is in prison. All right. Now, based on what Paul says here, just in those first few words, what do you think might be going on with Timothy as a result of where Paul is? He might be afraid. What else might he be? Apprehensive about continuing to do the work because he doesn't know how he's going to be received. What else? What word does Paul use? Embarrassed or ashamed? Yeah, so Timothy is dealing, it seems, with something here that is holding him back, and it seems that Paul is trying to help him recognize that he doesn't need to be ashamed because of where Paul is, for sure. And I think it would be easy for us to see that happening. Timothy, we think, is a pretty young man at this point in his life, and perhaps as a result of what happens to Paul, he's a little timid, he's a little uneasy, he's maybe losing heart a little in what's going on in his ministry as he's trying to do the work. I read something this week that I thought was really interesting, that I did not know. In 1963, when Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, he wrote a letter from his jail cell that was especially aimed toward church leaders who had been supporting him, sort of. All right? What had the only hang up between Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and these church leaders that were sort of supporting him was that they felt like he was pushing too hard too fast. Like he was trying to make too many changes too quickly and kind of wanted him to rein it in. All right? And this, excuse me. And this is what he wrote. He wrote, "I hope the church as a whole will meet the challenge of this decisive hour. But even if the church does not come to the aid of justice, I have no despair about the future." I look at Paul's message to Timothy here in 2 Timothy chapter 1, and I think it's really similar. Timothy may have been losing heart because of what he saw happening to Paul and maybe what he saw happening in other places in the world. But Paul's message in these verses is exactly what we all need to be reminded of when we need to refocus our hope and turn our attention away from all the terrible things going on in the world, all the challenges that we may face as a result. When we need to refocus our hope, this is the message that Paul sends to Timothy. Okay, Pete, I won't interrupt you again. You can start again from the beginning if you don't mind.
Who has saved us to call us to the holy calling
Okay, I want us to notice something else about the way this passage begins. It begins with that one of those key words in Scripture, therefore. All right, so we need to glance back for just a second and notice why Paul is giving these instructions to Timothy. Now, we got a little sense of that in the idea that maybe Timothy is ashamed or is struggling in what he's trying to do, but also notice verse 7 gives us a clue as well. What is Paul saying in verse 7? Okay, fear doesn't come from God. What does come from God? A power and love and a sound mind, or your translation might say self-control. All right? God has not given us a spirit of fear or timidity or whatever translation you have. Perhaps Timothy finds himself in a situation like Peter. You remember when the apostles are on the boat and they see Jesus walking across the water and they're afraid at first, but when they realize it's Jesus, what does Peter say? When they realize it's Jesus walking on the water, Peter says, okay, if it really is you, tell me to come out to you, right? And he does. And Peter is walking on the water. Incredible. Until what happens? He took his eye off the goal. Yeah. He's distracted and he sees the wind and the waves and all the things that make this make no sense in the world, right? All of a sudden he realizes, I shouldn't be doing this. This doesn't, why is this happening? And he begins to sink. I think much like Peter in that instance, we can imagine that Timothy may very well have started off great, very confident, very eager to do the work, but he has become afraid, perhaps, timid, uneasy, losing heart, perhaps embarrassed or ashamed. All of these things are kind of feeding into perhaps what Timothy is dealing with at this point in time, and Paul says, keep your eyes on the goal. You need to refocus. And so let's talk about where Paul draws Timothy's attention, because that is really the lesson for us in that we too, when we begin to lose focus and we begin to lose heart and we begin to be perhaps either afraid or ashamed of the gospel, the first thing that Paul says is, do not be ashamed. But I want you to notice there's a couple things Paul points to here. What is the first thing that Timothy is not to be ashamed of? The testimony of the Lord, right? Why might Timothy be ashamed of the gospel? Okay, because to non-believers, it makes no sense. Which means that non-believers are likely to respond to the gospel in what way or ways? Ridicule, mockery. What else? They might belittle you. What else? There may be persecution that results. What else? Well, I guess entailed in all of that is, of course, the rejection of you and what you're trying to teach. Look at that weirdo. Okay, so perhaps Paul needs to remind Timothy that the challenges to the gospel message the challenges to the truth that is in Jesus Christ is not something that you should ever be ashamed of. And directly tied to the testimony of the Lord, what is the second thing that Paul says Timothy should not be ashamed of? Of him, of Paul, right? Now, Paul says something here that's real subtle that I think is a clue as to why he's telling Timothy not to be ashamed. Anyone notice something a little unusual about what Paul says in these first few words? All right, very good. He says, his prisoner. Paul says he is the prisoner of the Lord, not Rome. Now, what do you think that implies? Say that again. Okay, he recognizes that this is God's will, that this is still a part of God's overall plan. Rome is not in control. God is. And I think that is incredibly important for Timothy and for us as well to hear. That even though Paul is imprisoned for preaching and teaching Jesus, the Lord is still in control. Don't give up hope just because circumstances aren't ideal. Don't give up hope just because they don't go the way that you expect. Don't give up hope just because you find yourself threatened by your faith. God is still in control. All right? Secondly, in order to help Timothy refocus his hope, notice that Paul invites Timothy, instead of being ashamed, share in suffering. What a great invitation. You know, wouldn't you like to hear that at the end of the sermon today? I invite you all to share in suffering. But that's what Paul says, isn't it? And I think he's trying to help Timothy realize you are hardly the first person to have to deal with persecution. So one, you're not alone in this. You're not the only person who has ever had to deal with a culture that opposes the truth. And you know, I think sometimes we feel like that, don't we? We look at the world and we say, man, I cannot believe all these terrible things going on in the world around us. I cannot believe the moral depravity that exists in the world around us, and how awful things have become, how much change has taken place in my lifetime. Woe is me. But we are not the first to ever deal with this. And we forget how thousands upon tens of thousands before us have faced morally depraved cultures, and we're still able to press forward. We're still able to continue in the testimony of the Lord, in their faith, in hope in Jesus. No, it's not going to be easy. But if the Lord is in control, then He is going to help us face whatever we have to face. So we can't be afraid to share in that suffering. And then lastly, in order to keep his focus, Paul tells Timothy to refocus on the gospel itself. And I really like a couple of the key phrases that Paul uses here in describing the gospel message. Two phrases that are really important. The first is when Paul reminds Timothy that Jesus has abolished death. All right, this is the same kind of phrasing that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, talking about the resurrection. And he says that the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Now, what kind of help is this for Timothy? What do you think this does for Timothy and really for us also to remember that Jesus has abolished death? Takes away the fear. How does it take away fear? Okay, you know that there is immortality in Christ. Therefore, what relevance does death have ultimately? Right? I remember when I was a kid and I would get in trouble in the car. You know what my parents told me? You just wait until we get home. And the whole rest of the car ride was miserable. And I think they knew that. They tortured me. Because, man, what does that mean when I get home? What's going to happen? What am I getting taken away from me? Am I going to be grounded? Or depending on the age, how many spankings am I going to get? Whatever. So, I'm going through, I'm mulling this over. And there was a point in life when I started thinking, apparently this happened a lot with me. I started thinking, at least they can't kill me. There's a lot of things that they can do to me that I may not like, but they can't kill me. So I would find some comfort in that, in knowing that they can't kill me. If Jesus' sacrifice on the cross and his subsequent resurrection from the dead has abolished death, then what can the world actually threaten us with? It's a little rhetorical, but the answer is nothing, right? No amount of rejection or ridicule or belittling matters. Even a threat on our actual lives doesn't matter because of our hope in Jesus. Because instead of focusing on the negatives, instead of being worried about what the world might be able to do, we can then focus on the fact that life and immortality have been brought to light through the preaching and teaching of Jesus Christ. The fact that we have something so much better to look forward to, whatever happens in this life is bearable. I want us to refer as we come to a close to one more passage. And I forgot to write it down, so let me look it up real quick. Matthew chapter 10. Let's turn there. Jesus is attempting to encourage his apostles. And earlier in this chapter, he sends them out. And he gives them instructions on how to teach, on what they're to teach, on what they're to do, and those sorts of things. And he basically says, you need to recognize that when you go out, it's going to be a challenge. Persecution's going to come. That's just the nature of it. So get ready. It's going to happen. And then he says, but don't be afraid. And in one of these verses, in a portion of what he says about the fear, in verse 28, he says, and do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. In other words, this life and whatever else may happen in it, whatever persecution may come, or rather, when persecution does come, that's not what matters. What matters is eternity. And I think that when we talk about hope in the face of cynicism, and especially when we talk about trying to refocus our hope and refocus our lives on our hope, that is a portion of the message that we have to hear, is that persecution's going to come. Okay? Things are not going to go exactly as you like or as you would prefer, because we live in a world that is full of a lot of sinful people, in a world that is full of a lot of evil, in a world that is full of a lot of things that we have seen in our lifetimes that have become more and more morally depraved. And as a result of that, the message of Jesus is not going to always be welcomed with open arms. But I think Jesus' message and Paul's message to Timothy is, so what? You'll get through it. Continue to press forward in the testimony of the Lord. Continue to share your faith. Don't let any possible persecution stop you and make you afraid. Instead, press forward in love and self-discipline and trust God to get you through to the end. All right, what other thoughts do you have this morning? Yes, sir. Oh my goodness gracious. Okay. Yes. Okay, verse 30 talks about counting every hair on your head, and Jesse wanted to make sure to mention that some have fewer hairs to count than others. Okay. That took me a minute. All right, let's pray together, and then we'll be done with our class this morning.